The story of the 20th century is the story of human triumph. It saw the world torn apart by wars and famines. It saw the emergence of nuclear weapons, the culmination of racial tensions, the fall of long powerful nations, and the rise of new ones. But despite all this, the human spirit prevailed. Here are first-hand accounts of this time, of war and peace, of recession and prosperity, of hatred and of acceptance. Since antiquity, the Jewish people have been persecuted throughout Europe, but in the late 19th century, many of them found a better option and went to America. Fleeing pogroms in Russia and the Slavic community, they came in droves. The United States' immigration peaked in this first decade of the 20th century.
So, no, the Jews were mistreated in Russia, and so, they didn't have any great feeling for back home.
This emigration only got stronger with the Great War of the 1910s, the rise of fascism during the 1920s, and the wave of fresh anti-Semitism in the 1930s was the writing on the wall for many Jews. In Italy, the Mussolini administration was increasingly dominated by Hitler's interests and increasingly hostile to the Jewish people. One such Jew, a young woman named Lina Ottolenghi, was the first woman enrolled in a prestigious college at the University of Pisa before the Manifesto of Race was passed in 1938, forcing her to discontinue her education. She only escaped Italy because Smith College in Massachusetts offered her a scholarship.
And when she departed from her family, which is a lower middle class family, which as Jews all sort of felt the storm clouds brewing, she certainly had a feeling that this was an ominous period and that bad things were going to happen. And she recalled never saying, because she didn't want to be so discouraging to her family, but alluding to the possibility that she was the only one who was going to survive, and she was the one who was going to perhaps represent the entire family.
But oddly enough, the rising anti-Semitism strengthened a sense of Jewish identity. When World War II broke out, it was a rallying cry for people all across the world, particularly an illegal Jewish immigrant named Elvio Sidun.
There were rumors that they were destroying the Jewish communities and maybe killing Jews. He kept on exclaiming over and over again to those who had advised him not to do anything about it, that he had to join the war effort because it was, quote, his war. That was an expression he used quite often. He had to join his war, fighting his enemies.
Elvio joined the U.S. forces and was the radio man telling the Italian fleet how to avoid mines when they surrendered. War raged on. But throughout it all, some were less interested in the war and more interested in the opportunities it provided. One girl, a young Angela O'Mallady, managed to keep a bright outlook. As food and other basic essentials were subject to rationing, she ran and played in the streets as any normal child would. Items were scarce and life was hard, but she managed to find a light area in a dark time.
The world was at peace until 1939. When World War II broke out, money quickly became scarce. Although food, tea, and coffee were rationed, people survived, knowing that this was important for our survival. As a child in those times, we still played in the streets with games like skipping and hopscotch. We cycled everywhere, as cars were only for the super rich. And roller skates were great fun, and many a scraped knee I suffered, as there were no such things as knee pads or elbow pads or helmets.
Although war killed many soldiers, it had a huge impact on civilians as well. Zofia Glazer, whose family was exiled from Poland when the Soviets invaded, just barely escaped the Holocaust by being exiled to Siberia, but did not escape discrimination.
Families were the only Jewish families. So when the Russians were saying, oh, we have Poles living with us, the Poles from our group were saying, oh no, they are not Poles, they are Jews, they are different. So we had everybody from the village would come to the door, stand and watch us, and then very disappointed say, but they are people like any other, they are no different. Because they expected some kind of strange beings living there.
A few thousand miles south, the Chinese government was being exiled too, to the island of Taiwan, off the coast of China, which had been under Japanese rule since the end of the First Sino-Japanese War. The Taiwanese people lived with this, but were decidedly not happy about it, and life was generally very unpleasant.
Life for the Taiwanese people was hard at that time, very hard. When Japan occupied Taiwan, they asked a lot from the Taiwanese people. Taiwan had to give food to them. They forced the Taiwanese people to join their army and die for them. Many Taiwanese people died and the economy was very bad.
Conditions became worse after Japan decided to expand its territory. After Versailles, Japan felt shortchanged in its gains. Under a new imperialist and expansionist policy, Japan started branching out into a Pacific empire. It attacked China, first grabbing Manchuria, then pushing down as far as Shanghai. It started asking more from its already conquered colonies, such as Korea and Taiwan.
Before the Kuomintang came, we were short of food and cloth. I didn't wear shoes for all my elementary years, you know. No shoes, just barefoot. I wore shorts, not pants. No shoes, no uniform. You just wore whatever you had.
So right after World War II, when the Chinese Civil War resumed and the Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, fought a losing fight against Mao Zedong's communists, Taiwan was the retreat point. In an effort to replace their lost troops, the Kuomintang started taking military-age boys straight from their houses and shoved guns in their hands before taking them on the long retreat to Taiwan. These young boys included Wang Sun-chin.
I learned how to do business from my father when I was young. Around 1948-1949, there was a civil war between the nationalists and communists in China. I was captured by the nationalists on August 9, 1949, and took to Jingmen. Then the communists attacked Jingmen, and it was also called Kuningtao. And I was injured there and transferred to Taiwan. After I recovered, I rejoined the army. In 1954, I was transferred to the transportation department and trained to be a driver in the army. I retired in 1979 from the army and became a taxi driver for 7 years before I was seriously sick. I stayed in the hospital for 7 months. After recovery, I was a driver in a preschool until I was 72, and then I retired.
The Kuomintang took over the island of Taiwan, but in the end they brought it much-needed reform, helping spur a radical economical transformation. What used to be a backwards little island quickly became much better.
After the Kuomintang came here, they were really working hard for the Taiwanese people. They had the martial law and put effort in for the economy. Before, Taiwan was in bad shape, but after around 1958-1959, life was getting better from the farms to general places. The land at that time was very cheap. There were not many houses, just bicycles. No motorcycles either, or just a few of them. When I was 17 or 18, there were not many motorcycles around. There wasn't much real estate or housing around either, or tall buildings.
In America, after the war, the atmosphere had shifted. Instead of trying to win a war, it was about trying to avert war. The closest the U.S. came to the nuclear war was in 1962, when word had reached the United States that there were nuclear missiles in Cuba. Here is a second-hand account, told by one who heard it directly from Castro. Apparently, after the Bay of Pigs incident, Castro turned to Russia and asked Khrushchev for military help. Castro was sure that Kennedy would try again, but this time with U.S. troops and not a ragtag band of Cuban exiles, and Castro knew that the Cubans could not stand up to American forces. But Khrushchev was not about to commit 500,000 Russian troops to Cuba. That was way beyond their means. What he proposed to Castro was that they instill nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, much like the U.S. had pointing at Russia from Turkey. Castro found this proposal acceptable, but he and Khrushchev differed sharply on one point. Each wanted to have control of the missiles. Each wanted to be the finger on the button. In the end, they came to an agreement that enabled each, independently, to fire the nuclear missiles into the U.S. if the horrible occasion warranted it. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy dealt with it by using the U.S. naval blockade. It should be noted that the CIA had it wrong when they advised Kennedy that the Cuban missiles were not yet armed with nuclear heads. In fact, a dozen missiles were finished and ready to go. When a Soviet ship was stopped and turned around, Castro considered this to be a clear violation of Cuban sovereignty and an act of war, so he pushed the button. But the 12 missiles didn't go off. Castro realized that he had not been given control over the missiles. He didn't have access to the correct code. From his point of view, he had been double-crossed by Khrushchev. And after leading the Kuomintang for nearly 30 years, on April 5, 1975, Chiang Kai-shek died.
When Chiang Kai-shek's birthday came on October 31st, 1963, he went to Long Tang, and there was an airport called Song Son. We celebrated his birthday for him. There were 10,000 people who sang for him and paraded. When he died, people went to see his body, and many people cried, especially people from China who were in the army with him. After Chiang, Jin Kao was president. At that time, we didn't elect the president as long as the Congress agreed. When Jin Kao was old, the Democratic People's Party protested and asked for the right to elect the president. And we elected the president, and Li Tonghe won the election. He was the first people-elected president. After he was the president for 12 years, Chen Shui-bian won the election.
One of the tourist attractions in Taipei today is a memorial dedicated to Chiang, with a larger-than-life statue of the man. In 1989, it shocked the world when the guiding hand of the Soviet Union dropped unexpectedly, and sent economies such as Cuba spiraling down. With the new rules that were part of the special period, they weren't allowed as much rum on their ration cards, which now limited them to 1 bottle per family per month. These rules had been written to help the now very strained economy. The government's hopes were that more of the valued aged Cuban rum could be exported for cash. Lily's patient and his sister would go into the woods where they knew of a person who would sell them bootlegged rum. This rum, in conjunction with malnutrition, turned out to be the cause of the blindness. But even while Cuba's economy tanked, the fall of the Soviet Union created a bubble in the Western countries. Following a rash of lowered corporate taxes and European Union and aid transfers, Ireland experienced a time of rapid economic growth. Averaging a 9.4% expansion rate over a 5-year period, wages went up and the unemployment rate went down. Ireland went from having a GDP per capita that was 2/3 that of the International Monetary Fund's group of advanced economies in 1989 to matching their levels in 1999, at which point they began to exceed them. But the Celtic Tiger, as this was called, crashed. What was initially one of the greatest economic booms in Ireland's history had turned into one of its worst recessions. Initially, wages went up, but so too did prices. Job opportunities increased, and many economic migrants came to Ireland. Money was very cheap to borrow, with interest rates at an all-time low, and I got a credit card for the first time. Then the Tiger collapsed, wages dropped, unemployment rose, and the government increased taxes in an attempt to repay our banking debts and rebuild a broken economy. This has resulted in middle-income earners like me finding it very hard to pay for normal everyday living expenses and to make any provision for the future.